Hi everyone. This is a video about a paper that I recently published in the journal Idealistic Studies. The paper is called Two Defenses of Kant Against the Neglected Alternative Objection. So this objection alleges that the critique of pure reason's dismissal of the possibility that things in themselves are spatiotemporal is unjustified. Proponents of the neglected alternative typically argue that Kant's thesis that things in themselves are not spatiotemporal is inconsistent with his thesis that things in themselves are unknowable. So the paper looks at arguments from Bird and Waxman, who attempt to demonstrate both that Kant is not inconsistent on this point and that his denial that things in themselves might be spatiotemporal is justified. Instead, in this paper, I argue that their defenses of Kant don't work and that Kant is indeed inconsistent in holding both that things in themselves are not spatiotemporal and that things in themselves are unknowable. So a few words about this. Kant, in his critique of pure reason, had argued that human beings and other possible knowers that would be similar to human beings have no way of knowing the nature of things in and of themselves. So reality as it is independently of our ability to know it, to think about it, and so on. Instead, Kant argued, and here he followed the British empiricists, that everything that we experience is conditioned by various factors that come from the side of cognition. So basically the mind, in the case of human beings, the human mind, conditions the material that it receives from so-called reality, right? So Kant thinks there is some actual reality that's independently existent of our minds. That is what he calls things in themselves. However, we can't know those things because everything that we do know is conditioned by our own sensibility. And this includes, for Kant, crucially, space and time. So for him, space and time are not properties of things in themselves, but rather they are conditions of our sensibility as part of our cognition, and all of the experiences that we have are conditioned by space and or time as sort of necessary conditions of our ability to think about anything. So this was a radical thesis, very interesting, leads to all sorts of possibilities and potential solutions to long-standing problems in philosophy. But I wanted to focus in this paper on one particular issue. So Kant says because everything that we know comes through our sensibility, so certain factors that are inherent in us as knowers, but not inherent in the world itself, such as space and time, it followed, he thought, that we can't know what things in themselves are actually like. So some people view this as a kind of skeptical thesis on Kant's part, although Kant would want to resist that and say, no, I'm not a skeptic. That's for a different video, a different time. However, what he does say is that not only is it the case that space and time are features of our own cognition, but he flat out denies that they are or even can be features of things in themselves. So space and time comes from the knower or the cognizer, you and me. It does not come from things in themselves. So the so-called neglected alternative that some philosophers had pushed as a criticism of Kant shortly after he had published his Critique of Pure Reason was to say that there's this neglected alternative, right? A possibility that Kant overlooked, which is simply this, that sure, he might be correct that space and time are features of our cognition, but could it not also be the case that things in themselves also happen to be spatiotemporal? So the analogy to this that I use is imagine that you are walking around wearing glasses with green-colored lenses. Everything that you see is going to be tinted green. From that, you would not be justified in inferring that nothing is green once you take those glasses off, right? So as a matter of fact, you take the glasses off and it turns out, okay, not everything's green, but some things still are. This is roughly analogous to the idea of the neglected alternative that Kant supposedly overlooked, the idea that, well, space and time, as far as we know, come only from the cognizer, right? They are necessary conditions of our ability to think and to have possible experiences. But that doesn't rule out the possibility that space and time might also actually be features of things in themselves. And this has led to a controversy that's been ongoing, right, ebbing and flowing for a couple centuries now, and people still write about this and think about this. So in this paper, I argue that the neglected alternative objection is actually correct, that it may be, although we have no reason to suppose so from Kant's point of view, it nonetheless may be the case that things in themselves are spatiotemporal, that we are not justified in denying that possibility. We can't say, or at least according to me, there's no basis for saying that things in themselves are definitely non-spatial and non-temporal. So, as I mentioned before, one of the motivations for this objection, the neglected alternative objection, is to say that, well, because Kant said that things in themselves are completely unknowable, at least to creatures like you and me, he nonetheless proceeded to make a claim about things in themselves, namely that they are definitely not spatial and definitely not temporal. And that seems to be an inconsistency, right? It appears to be an incompatibility. If I can't know anything about things in themselves, then it seems like I can't know that they're not spatiotemporal, right? Instead, if things in themselves are purely unknowable, I should remain agnostic to say, for example, things in themselves might have spatial and temporal properties. I have no reason to suppose that they do, and I can have no way of knowing that, but I can also have no way of ruling that out on principle. So that's my view, right? And there are various arguments. I won't go into the detail here, but engagements with these recent work by Bird and Waxman that have tried to defend Kant, and I push back against some of their arguments, but the general idea is that there is indeed an inconsistency between the unknowability thesis that Kant proposes and the non-spatiotemporality thesis. Right? So both of those are about things in themselves. On the one hand, we can't know anything about them, and yet Kant seems to say that we know that they are spatiotemporal. Now, one worry that some people might have is that this might threaten, if we acknowledge the neglected alternative and say, sure, things in themselves might in fact be spatiotemporal, some people might have the worry that this would undermine Kant's entire project. So, for example, Kant wanted to preserve room for what he ends up calling in the Critique of Practical Reason, postulates of practical reason. So this idea that we have to postulate the existence of God, an immortal soul, and freedom of the will. Right? Kant thinks we need those things in order to make sense of the possibility of ethics, the fact that we could be morally obligated to one another and to ourselves to do various things and to avoid doing others. So you might think, well, if Kant allows that things in themselves are spatiotemporal, then that would seem, for example, to threaten the possibility of free will. As Kant argues elsewhere in the Critique of Pure Reason, he thinks that in order to actually be obligated and to actually be under some sort of moral duty requires that we not be subject to causal determinism. Right? So Kant thinks if we are moral beings, then it must be the case that we are not determined by cause and effect as everything else in our experience seems to be. The problem being, how could we hold someone morally responsible for something that they could not have done otherwise? So, for example, the person who commits murder, well, if that's just necessitated by cause and effect, going back to something about their childhood or genetic factors, environment, and so on, then you might say it's a bad thing that they did, but they had no choice in a certain sense. So you can see why Kant might have been motivated to say things in themselves, which is where free will would reside, something that we don't know anything about, except not spatiotemporal, right? And therefore not subject to the law of causality, leaving room for the possibility of moral responsibility. However, as I argue in the paper, we don't have to make that move. So if we take the unknowability thesis seriously, then we should say we have no idea whatsoever what things in themselves are. They may be spatiotemporal. They may be something else entirely. We simply don't know. We have no basis. So that being the case, if we take that sort of pure agnostic point of view, that still leaves room for Kant's practical postulates. he can still argue that, well, as far as we know, we may have free will in terms of things in themselves, even if in our experience it seems like our behavior and everything else in the natural world is subject to causal explanation. As far as we know, things in themselves may leave room for a genuine kind of free will. Now, by saying that things in themselves might be spatiotemporal does not necessarily undermine that, because that is simply a possibility, right? An epistemic possibility that we are acknowledging. So, on my view, we still have no basis to think that things in themselves are spatiotemporal, much less that they are subject to cause and effect somehow. But it seems that if Kant's serious about the unknowability thesis, he can't straight out claim that things in themselves are definitely non-spatiotemporal. Rather, he should have said, they might be. We hope that they are, perhaps. We practically postulate that we are free, which means not subject to space, time, and causality as things in themselves. He can still say all of that, because by his own lights, we can't know that stuff is true, but the fact that we don't know the actual nature of things in themselves leaves room for us to make practical postulates. So we have a kind of faith that we have free will. There's still room for that. Okay, so that's the general gist of the paper and the arguments. Let me know what you think about that. As always, the paper is available for free. I have the link below, so just navigate to the Fill Papers link and click on the green button in the top right, and that will download a PDF. The version that you'll have access to is the proofs version, so the only changes relative to the published version in the journal itself would be minor typos fixed here and there, but nothing substantive, so all of the arguments and even the pagination for the most part should all be the same. Okay, so thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.